So there's three kind of main components to controlling the exposure in your camera. Traditionally, I think a lot of people thought about it as two controls, because the shutter speed and the aperture were the ones that you would mostly control while you were shooting, and then the film speed, which is now kind of ISO in the digital world, the film speed wasn't something that you would change out mid-roll. You'd have to choose the film with the film speed that you wanted, so that wasn't really a factor as much. But nowadays, it is a big factor, and that sensitivity, or the ISO, is something that helps you to be able to use the shutter speed and the aperture that make the most sense for what you're doing. So let's first talk about shutter speed. And if you're going to be using one of the auto modes of the camera, if you put it in shutter priority, you basically set the shutter speed, and the camera will evaluate the scene and select the aperture that best fits, the exposure, or the shutter speed that you've selected. So an example of like a high-speed shot would be, this is an image that I made where I had 2 drips of water dripping into a shallow pan, and as the first drip kind of rebounded back up again, or splashed back up, the second drip collided with it, and it was one of those random things where I shot probably 100 photos that day, and maybe 10 of them worked out where the timing was just right. It's a very tricky, timing kind of a thing. But using speed lights to light this so that way I could catch this really quick action, that's how I was able to really capture this with a high-speed shutter. Again, timing and a high-speed shutter, and I'll show a wider shot of this. This is kind of cropped in, but I was on a photography trip, and I was just shooting some trees with the snow in the background, and with the snow melt, it was dripping off, and I didn't see that this is what it was looking like. It was going very quickly, but I was trying to capture the drips just as they were breaking free, and then taking a look later, I realized this is what I was getting, which is really interesting. And then you can actually see a reflection in the lowest strip. You can see it in all of them, but you can see it easiest in the lowest one. That's me standing there with the camera flashing. And if you can tell, there's a little bit of a yellowish tint to the light. And I'll talk more about that later, but that's a little trick you can do to kind of saturate the background a little bit when you're using fill flash, or flash in general with your photography for close-up subjects. So a little bit slower shutter speed. So this is, again, just an image of a motorcycle riding by. That the motorcycle looks like it's relatively sharp because they're pacing me while I'm here in the car, but the background is blurring by. So it conveys that sense of motion. And so this is where you're selecting the shutter speed because you want to be able to capture the image, but at the same time you want to be able to convey whatever emotion that you want to pull from your viewer. This is a rather long exposure, but with a built-in timer. This is a I think this might have been a 10 or 20-second exposure in slot canyons in Page, Arizona. And I'll show some more images from this a little bit later, but this is one of those places where you can see with the naked eye that it's light enough that you can get around, you're not tripping over anything. But nothing is moving. These rocks have not moved for a long time, so you can use a higher ISO and probably get this in a second or so, maybe, with using a high ISO. But this is where you're balancing out, and I'll talk more about ISO in a minute, but you can use a lower ISO, and I'll talk about the advantages, but in doing so, you have a longer exposure. And what ends up happening is it slowly lights up the whole cavern, and you'll see the beams of light as they might come down through the cracks and things like that. And what you're actually seeing with the light is the dust that's in the air kind of passing through the light. So over the course of a longer exposure, you'll get these clouds of dust that pass through, and it gives a more complete beam of light rather than something that might come through high and then one might come through a little bit lower. And I'll talk more about that later. But this is shot on film about 10 or 15 years ago. This is a 10-minute exposure. And interesting thing here was this is Western Maryland, out at a cabin called the Little Orleans Cabin, which is part of the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club's cabins that they maintain. And so this is just a little cabin with a camping lantern, a little kind of a gas fuel camping lantern sitting on the porch there. And it was relatively dark with just a dim light. But over the course of 10 minutes, and the camera on the tripod, the light from that lantern just burns in and burns into the sensor, or in this case into the film. And over that course of that time, and I couldn't really tell exactly what I was going to be getting because I couldn't preview it and I had to go and develop it before I really knew. But it looks like the cabin's this inferno of light, and it's also casting light on the side of the shed next to it. But the other thing that's interesting is that all these trees would have been silhouetted, maybe with the exception of the ones all the way to the left, by that light. So what I did was I was walking around the whole time with this flashlight, and I was painting light into the trees. They call that painting with light. So I was basically just going back and forth, trying to get a nice even wash back and forth. And as I'm hitting the trees, for that moment it burns into the film. And because I never faced the camera or the flashlight toward the camera, that never actually directly burns in, so you don't see me walking around at all. So, so this is about a 10-minute exposure, and this is about an hour. So this is probably midnight or slightly thereafter. And so this just shows you that you can get brightly, exposed images anytime there's any light, really. You just need some light that you can accumulate over time. And so you're seeing the North Star as the Earth is rotating, appearing to be still while you have star streaks all around it.
This film?
This is film as well, yeah.
No wind.
No, yeah, well, if the trees moved a little bit, it might appear a little soft, but yeah, they would probably average out into a kind of a middle ground, so they would not appear to be moving too much, I guess.
So were you using a tripod?
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, It was a timer where you can basically press and slide the trigger, and it holds it into a lock position, so that way you shoot as long as you want, basically. So you're just looking at your watch to do that kind of a thing. Most cameras max out at 30 seconds for exposure. So anything beyond that, you're either using the bulb mode and holding the button down. And the problem with doing that is even if you have a really sturdy tripod, you can't help but to just vary the pressure a little bit. And over the course of a minute or so, you might make the camera shift a little bit, especially if there's any bright lights that are burning in more quickly. You'll see little streaks from that. But something like this, you don't have to sit there and hold the button, and you can just take it easy for the hour or however long you're shooting for. So going to the next control, which is your aperture dial, and the aperture is the opening for how much light is getting into the lens and into the sensor of the camera. So just to kind of give you a quick overview of the differences in the numbers, you'll hear people refer to f-stops. The larger the opening, the smaller the f-stop number. So you'll see in this case, if the lens can go to f2.8, that would be considered wide open. And then typical for the most closed down, the smallest aperture is f22, and some can go higher. But the other thing you'll notice from this is they're saying on the left side of the scale here that you'll get softer images with the larger aperture, and you'll get sharper images with the smaller aperture. And the reason that's the case is because when you have the aperture wide open, you have a shallower depth of field. So the depth of field is basically how much of the area that you're looking at is in focus. And if you're using an extremely small aperture, like a good example would be like a pinhole camera, you can have basically right in front of the camera all the way to infinity, all in focus. Whereas if you're shooting, let's say, with an f1.2 lens, which is probably the extreme on the other side of things, your focal distance can be so shallow that it can be very, very challenging just to get a shot that actually has any real sharpness to it. And you'll see that used a lot in creative portraiture, where they're intentionally throwing out the background focus area. But so the balance between your shutter speed and your aperture is how you're basically getting the exposure that you need. So in other words, if you want to be able to use images that are as sharp as possible, you're using a smaller aperture, a larger f-stop number. It's going to give you that. Do you guys want to? There's some seats in the back here as well. If you guys want to come, and there's one over here as well. But it's that balance of your shutter speed and your aperture that's going to give you the exposure that you need. And so there's actually like what they would call like a sweet spot with most lenses, where even though I'm saying it's sharper at f22, most lenses typically are at their sharpest at the middle range of their ISO. So if a lens is a 2.8 to 22 f-stop range, maybe like f8 or so might be where it's actually at its sharpest. Maybe not necessarily at the deepest depth of field, but at whatever you're focused on will look the sharpest at whatever that sweet spot is for that particular lens. And so just quickly looking at some examples, shooting at f22 with some depth in a shot, you see the grass in the foreground looks like it's pretty well in focus, which is where the focus actually is. And then in the background, it does go out of focus a little bit, but it's pretty much in focus. You can make out individual blades of grass and flowers, pretty much all the way to the back of the image. Whereas if you shoot at f7, which is still a middle of the ground f-stop, that's not a wide open aperture, and you can see where the background's blurring out. So if you're thinking about how you might want to use these images, for example, if you're doing the posters, for example, like we used for tonight to invite you all to come to this presentation, if you were planning on putting text across the top, then maybe it would make sense to blur out the background so that way it would sit on that area nicer. Or if you really wanted to feature something in the foreground, what better way to do that maybe than to take the distraction away of everything in the background, and you still have the feeling of the grass and the color and everything, but there's that separation there. So you'll see that done a lot with portraiture, where you'll have a photo of somebody or some object, and the background is blurred out with the intention of drawing the focus on whatever the subject in the foreground is. So this is a good example of a photo that is probably a little bit underexposed on the subject, our sailor here, and overexposed in the background. But I wanted to show the more extreme side of it with a f1.8 aperture, which is a 50mm f1.8 lens was used on this, which is probably, I have to recommend, is the best lens for the money that's out there. The Nikon f1.8 50mm lens is about $130. The Canon one's just over $100, I believe. And I've heard people call it the thrifty 50. But basically, because the optics are probably the easiest to make, there's less that's involved, so it ends up being an inexpensive lens, and so therefore you can get a really fast lens for relatively inexpensive. So this is great for portraiture as well as a fixed lens for doing nature photography. It's not going to zoom way in, and it's not going to give you a really wide shot. It's a fixed lens, and I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between. It could be used for film or digital.
You
Yeah.
want it that kind of price.
Yep. It's a full frame lens, so you can use it on 35mm bodies as well. And I'll talk more about both the crop factor size differences and differences between zoom and primes and stuff a little bit later as well. This was shot with a relatively old lens. I think it was like a late 60s lens. I bought it on eBay. It was a 55mm Nikon AIS lens, I think it was. I still have it, but I don't use it quite as much nowadays because I have a better macro lens. But I picked it up used for about $45, and it shoots great photos. And other than the fact that everything is manual with it, it doesn't even, on some bodies at least, it doesn't even give you any feedback as far as your exposure. You have to basically shoot and then look at your histogram on the back to see where things are. But on some bodies, it does give you a little bit more feedback. But the thing I'm pointing out here is that even the f3.5 being the widest this lens would go, there's an extremely shallow depth of field. And that's something that's just inherent to macro photography. And you'll see that on the other end as well. With a really long telephoto lens, if you're shooting an object with a, let's say, a 400 or 600mm lens, or even a 200mm lens, and then there's objects that are in the distance and you're relatively far away shooting this object, it tends to throw the background really out of focus. Even if all the settings are the same as if you shot with, let's say, like a 50mm lens, you'll notice a drastic difference in that depth of field. So in this case, if you would want to have the whole be in focus, it would be difficult. And there's a couple of tricks you can do. I'll show a light in a little bit, but bringing in light is one of the ways that you can add depth to your shot. Because if you think about it, you're balancing the exposure. If you're basically exposing an image with more light on your subject, then you have to squeeze down your iris a little bit to compensate for the extra light that's there. So by closing down your aperture, you end up having a deeper depth of field. So it's not going to be a whole lot. You might maybe double the depth of field. You're not going to be able to get the whole be in focus by doing that. But that's something you can do to help do that. If it's something that's not moving, there's some tricks that you can do. There's a thing called focus stacking, where you can basically use a tripod, and if everything is very still, you can shoot and then shoot a sequence of photos where you shift your focus a little bit, so that way that that really sharp area moves through the depths of the photo, and then you can use Photoshop to basically combine them all. And it takes just the portion that's the sharpest from each, and then it combines it all together, and it gives you this kind of like fake extra depth of field. And it actually works really well, but it has to be something that's not moving at all, or else it can't combine the images. So again, we were talking the third thing being the ISO, or the sensitivity. When people talk about a low ISO, typically that's between 50 and 200, depending on the body that you're using, the camera you're using. And that's thought of being less sensitive. It takes longer for that light to produce the image on the sensor. A byproduct of that is that it produces lower digital noise. So the images generally look crisper and sharper, and it's just slower for the image to capture. Higher ISOs on cameras these days are 1600, 3200, some of the times 6400, or on some of the highest end cameras, over 100,000. And it's not like throughout that whole range you're getting the sharpest photos. There's a trade-off. As you go into these higher ISOs, you get more digital noise. And it's kind of like film grain, But a lot of people think of film grain as pleasing, whereas most people never think of the digital noise as pleasing. Some people don't like film grain, but it's it depends on your taste. Where digital noise is usually like a color version of that. That's kind of like this weird kind of just spattering of pixels. It's hard to describe it if you haven't seen it, but as soon as you see it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And the reason this does this is because when the sensor is kind of working harder and it's being more sensitive, it heats up and it produces this noise as a product of that heat. And I'll talk more about sensor size a little bit later, but just really quickly, the larger sensors, which is one of the reasons why pro photographers like to use full frame, when they call a full frame sensor or body that shoots basically the size of a 35 millimeter sensor compared to, let's say, like a point and shoot camera, which has a much tinier sensor. The denser the pixel resolution on the sensor, the more it tends to heat up. So if you have a larger sensor, even if it's a relatively high megapixel camera, they're spread out more. The photo areas are spread out more where it's capturing the image, so it tends to make less heat. Where if you have a point and shoot camera, typically if you shoot anywhere close to these, what you call a higher ISO, you can't help but to get the noise. It's the trade-off of having the small compact camera. The positive side to the smaller compact cameras, other than the fact that they're easier to carry and everything, is that because the sensor is so much smaller, the optics to produce the image on that photo area can be much smaller. So you can have a camera. My cousin was just emailing me, and she's got a Canon, I forget what the model is now, but it's got something like the equivalent of 24 to 800 something millimeter zoom, all in this compact. It's not like a real small that you can stick in your pocket, but it's a relatively small point and shoot camera. So for amateur wildlife photographers, that could be a real asset to be able to shoot at 800 millimeters and pull in that far away. And if conditions are right, it will perform pretty well. But if you need to shoot in lower light, or if you're in conditions where the ISO is going to become more of a challenge, then the trade-off is that you can crop in tighter and get that magnification at the cost of your photos just aren't going to look as good. So just a general rule of thumb I tell people is to keep the ISO as low as you can. You'll find some people say, well, I'll set it to auto and it'll just wander on its own. Or if I set it up to a medium or a high ISO, I can always get the photos I need because it'll just shoot at a higher shutter speed or at a smaller aperture, not realizing that, yes, it'll work through a wider variety of conditions, but they're going to always have more noise than they might have otherwise. So generally, keep it low, and if you feel like you just can't get the shutter speed you need with the aperture that you want to use, then start to jump it up a little bit higher. So here's just a couple examples of some photos taken at different f-stop and shutter speed combinations. These are all shot at ISO 100 with one of those 50 millimeter f1.8 lenses. And so you can see in this example, this is a shot taken on campus at the college. Relatively close portrait. The background parking lot, you can make out individual cars. The focal depth is pretty deep. So this is shot at f22. Typically, I wouldn't say you want to shoot at a 15th of a second, but don't pay attention to the lighting's also not great either. I'm just trying to demonstrate the balance between the shutter speed and the aperture here. So as we double the aperture size and we go to f11, we quadruple the shutter speed. And it doesn't always work out exactly like that because it has to fall into, as it meters, lights, what's that? Yeah, it makes her smile. So you'll see that it quadruples, and then as we do it, it makes her laugh, and we go to the next one. So a 200th of a second would have been, or I guess a 240th of a second would have been quadrupling, but it doesn't quite work out, so it's whatever the closest thing is. And again, going at 2.8, it just about quadruples. The lens maxes out at f1.8, so it doesn't quite get to where it quadruples again, but if you shot at f1.4, you would probably see that quadrupling again with the shutter speed. But now you're noticing that not only is the focus more on her, the background is no longer a distraction. It looks like it's a tree. It could be a pond or whatever back there. You don't see any of the distraction of the parking lot or whatever. You can't even make out the fact that it was a brick walkway behind her. So, that's one of the things to keep in mind is depending on how you want to represent your image, it's kind of hard to see it. You have to think photographically, as I like to call it, about the way things are going to represent when you change your camera settings because your eyes, you can't make this happen with your eyes, And then the third of the three is the manual mode. And I like to, people use the phrase P does not mean perfect. The P, the program mode that most cameras have. It's great when you need to be able to pick up the camera and take a quick shot and not really worry about things. But it does what it thinks is the right thing to do, which is not always whatever the ideal outcome is, And So some of the reasons you might use manual, you might want to, you can't predict what the levels are going to be because you're using some kind of a lighting that's varying. So let's say you're shooting in the dark and you want to use a passing car headlight. You might kind of meter when the first car goes by and then leave it set and then know that it's probably going to be similar when the next car goes by or whatever you might think. If you're shooting, let's say fireworks is a good example. They vary from shot to shot. So if you meter for the dark of the sky and then do a long exposure and then the firework explodes, it's going to be so overexposed. Plus it's going to shoot an extremely long exposure because it's going to think, oh, it's so dark, I have to shoot for 30 seconds to get anything out of the shot. If you're using off-camera strobes, the light's not being factored in to the image. It's, it only fires off the strobe, and I'm not talking about like a speed light or a camera top flash, but I'm talking more about like a studio strobe or something that you would use that way. For creative special effects, or if you want to do predictable shots. If you're shooting, like, let's say, a number of photos all across a horizontal area because you intend to go into the Photoshop and stitch them all together and make a really wide panoramic with it, if you set the camera to some kind of an auto mode, not only might your depth of field shift as you're shooting, but the exposure will shift because if you're shooting toward the sun, it's going to be backlit more, so the foreground's going to darken, and as you shoot away from the sun, it's going to shift to compensate for that. So what you would want to do is kind of find that middle ground of where your exposure is going to be about the middle of your range, and then lock it in by using manual mode, and then shoot all your images, and that way they'll all have the same exposure. And you'll still have some variations in the sky because if you're shooting towards the sun, of course the sky is going to be more brightly lit, but it's not going to affect the way your photo looks. It'll actually stitch together pretty well because it should be a gradual change across the sky as you're stitching it. And the last thing is just whenever you want to have full control, if you're doing some creative things, I guess. Here's an example of a shot taken just before sunset, where the camera would have brightened this quite a bit because the average color or the average exposure here is darker than it should be. But I wanted to try to get some more saturation in the sky and really show the color. And I didn't care the fact that the trees would be silhouetted. In fact, there was houses and things that would be in the shot if I hadn't done this. So this is a way to disguise the things I didn't really care about and feature more that little wisp of cloud that was going across the sun. You couldn't even see that when you exposed it more because it just totally washed out that area. And it's still very washed out, but it gives a little bit more saturation. Same thing with this. This was taken with a point and shoot camera that, but had the ability to shoot manually with it. So again, the background areas, I didn't really care if I could see the houses and things. I just wanted to be able to get the color of the sky and the reflection on the water. This is another photo taken on film. This is about a 5-minute exposure, and when I was metering it, the moon was rising in the background. It's not actually the sun, it's the moon rising, and it was a bright enough area that it was throwing off my my exposure. So I did a couple of shots with varying my manually varying the exposure, so that way we could try a few different things. And what you're actually seeing here, this is a cabin up in Harriman State Park in New York, a little lean-to, I guess, not a cabin, but they have these fireplaces, and we were basically burning leaves in there. And every once in a while, a little ember would go out the top of the fireplace. So over the course of the 5 minutes, my friend and I we're shoving leaves in this thing as fast as we can and trying to get these little embers to come out. And you don't even hardly see them when it's happening. But over the course of 5 minutes or whatever the 10 minutes when I've been, you'll see all these little streaks of red coming out. So it looks almost like there's fire coming out the chimney, but it wasn't really as dangerous as it looks like it might have been. So, and here's an example on campus with a fireworks display at the beginning of the school year in the fall. And again, not knowing what the fireworks are going to look like, how big the explosion is going to be, or how much light they're going to produce. From one shot to the next, it's a gamble. So that's where, again, shooting digital, you can just shoot and shoot and shoot, and it doesn't really make a difference. You just delete the ones that didn't work out the way you wanted to. I think I was doing about a 10-minute exposure here, and again, locked down on a tripod.